In this video, I'm going to show you how to use JWT tokens to protect REST endpoints. I'm also going to show you how to create users and then assign JWT tokens to such users so that they can access certain endpoints in a Spring Boot application. I'm going to try and keep this video simple and concise, so let's start right away. If you want to follow along, go on Spring Initializer and let's create a Spring Boot project. I'm going to be using version 3.5.5 and we're going to be needing some dependencies. So we're going to need Spring Web, Spring Security, Lombok, Spring Data JPA, and a H2 database. I have opened the downloaded project in IntelliJ. So let's start by adding some more dependencies. So if you go to the pom.xml file, we are going to add 3 more dependencies which we're going to need to generate JWT tokens in our application. If you go here and if you add these 3 dependencies, the JWT API, JWT implementation, and the Jackson one. And here I have the latest versions. If you're watching this video in the future, please make sure you've got the latest versions. The next thing we now need to do is do some application.properties configurations. So we're going to need this later, but basically we're going to configure the H2 database and the JWT secret. If you go on your application.properties and you add these application properties to this file, the first one is for a H2 database. I've explained this multiple times in my other videos, but basically H2 is a fast in-memory database, which is quite good for prototyping. In simple words, we're going to save user details in this H2DB by creating a user details table. I'm going to show you that later. And you can also see some JWT configurations. I've defined a JWT secret. This is going to be the private key that we're going to use to generate JWT token that we're going to distribute to users. According to the standard and definitions, ideally this secret should be 32 bytes long and it should only contain numbers and letters. And that's what I've created here. So this is completely random. You can create your own if you want. I've also set an expiration property. So this should give us, this is in milliseconds by the way, so this should be 1 hour. Whatever JWT we generate is going to expire in 1 hour time. If you wanted it for 24 hours, you can go here and modify this property. As I said, we're going to be saving username and password in a table in our H2 database. To do that, let's first go to our main package and let's create a new package. In this case, we're going to call it entity. In this entity, you want to create a user class. Simply, this is going to be represented by the table named users and it's an entity. So we want to add the entity tag and we also want to add some Lombok annotations such as the data, no args constructor, all args constructor. In here we want to add an ID, which is going to be a long, and a string username and a string password. If you're wondering, we're not going to be saving the password in plain text. We're going to do some encryption later on before saving it to the DB. So let's add the ID tag to our ID attribute. And we want this to be generated automatically. So this is going to be a generation type identity. We also want the username to be unique. We don't want 2 users with the same username. So we're going to simply add this annotation over the username attribute. Okay, we've got our user entity. Let's now create a user repository. So we're going to create a new package called repository. Let's call it user repository. So this is going to be our interface. And this is going to extend JPA repository. By the way, if you're interested in finding out more about JPA and repositories, I have other videos in my channel which you can check out. So this is going to represent a user entity and the ID is a long. We're going to add 2 queries. We want to find a user by the username. So username, and we want to also check if a user already exists and return a boolean if it actually does. Find by username. So we've got our entity class, we've got our repository. Let's now start looking at how we can generate a JWT token and then use such JWT token to protect our REST endpoints and authenticate users. The first thing we need to do is create a new package, and I'm going to call this security. In here, we want to create a JWT util class. We're going to tag this as a component. I also want to add SLF4J so that you can have some logging. In here, we actually want to import our properties that we defined earlier in the application.properties. So we want our JWT secret and we want the expiration as well. What we're doing now is creating our utility class. We also want to create a private secret key object. Let's define it here. What we want to first do is initialize the key after the class has been instantiated. So we're going to add a post construct and we're going to call it public void init, and we want to initialize our key. We're going to use this static method from this JSON web token security.keys. As input, as you can see, we're giving our JWT secret key that we have defined in the application.properties. Let's now define another method that is actually going to generate our JWT. So I'm going to call it public string generate token. As input, we're going to provide a username, and now we're going to do the implementation here. We're going to return a JWTs.builder. We're going to define a subject. So in this case, the subject is the username. We also want to set a issuing date, new date. This is going to set it as the current date. So we want to set expiry date. As we said, we have defined the expiration in milliseconds. So I've defined it here. One thing to notice is expiration is current time plus the expiration in milliseconds. We want to sign our key using the key we have created up here. And let's call the compact at the end. Okay, so the error up here is something we've seen also before. For some reason, IntelliJ tries to import the Lombok value when in theory we want the Spring Framework value annotation. That error is gone. So we basically completed our generate token method. The other method we want is the ability to be able to get the username from a JWT token string get user from token. Given a string token, what we want to do is return using a JWTs parser. We want to verify with our key. And then we want to build this. And then we want to parse the signed claims of this token. We want to get the payload and get the subject. So as we defined up here, the subject is going to give us the username that we have set while generating the token. So using these utility methods, we're going to parse our subject by doing all of this. In the end, we want a validation method, public boolean, validate JWT token, and we want to check if the token given to us is actually valid. And we can simply do this with a try catch. If we are able to verify with our key the JWT token passed, it means that it's valid. If we can't, this is going to throw an exception. We're going to catch the exception and then return false. It's as simple as that. We have created our utility class, which we're going to use later on in this video. So the next thing we want to do is create user details. We want to be able to save these user details somewhere when a user tries to log in. I have not explained this before, but we're going to be providing two endpoints, the sign-in endpoint and the sign-up endpoint, so that the user can get authenticated and be provided with a JWT token. To do that, we need to be able to save these details somewhere. To do that, there is something called user detail service, which is provided by Spring Security. What we want to do is actually create a new package. I'll call it service. And let's create a new class called custom user details service. This is going to be tagged as a service class and is going to implement user details service from Spring Security. We want to auto-wire our user repository. So we're going to inject it in the constructor. We want to override the method that is provided by user detail service. We're going to load users by username. These users are going to be the ones saved in our repository. We're going to first get a user from our DB, in this case the h2db. So we're going to do user equal to user repository dot find by username. If you remember, we created this earlier. If this exists, it's going to return as a user, but if it doesn't, we want to throw a username not found exception. If the user exists, we're going to return a new user details user. So this is not the user we created in the entity package, but it's a user provided by actually the Spring Security package. We want to set the username to the username we have retrieved from our repository, and the password to be the one retrieved by the repository too. In here, there are no claims, so we can set it to empty. We don't care about this one, but you can assign some roles if you really wanted to these users. In our case, we don't want them for this little project. This class is going to be loading in a custom user detail service the users we have saved in our h2db. The next thing we want to do is actually handle unauthorized requests. To do that, let's go back to the security package. Let's create a new class called auth entry point JWT. This is going to be a component. In here, we want this class to implement authentication entry point. We want to implement the method in this interface, which is called comments. What do we want here? As I said, we want to send a response saying HTTP unauthorized. So in this case, this is going to send a 401. And we want to send a message. In this case, I think this is quite self-explanatory. The next thing we need to do is create a filter. In the Spring Security, we're going to add the auth token filter. So if you know a little bit about Spring Security, there is something called the security filter chain, where every HTTP request gets filtered through. As the name says, it's a chain. In this case, we are just adding a new filter in the security chain. We're going to extend this once per request filter. As the name says, this is going to be run once per request. And we want to implement the doFilter internal method. And we want to tag this as a component class, and let's also add some logging using slf4j. In this class, we're going to be using the util methods we have created earlier. Let's go here at the top and let's auto-wire our private JWT util class. JWT util. And we also want to wire the private customer user detail service we have created just now. So we can now start filling the doFilter method. Let's add a try. So in here, we first want to get the JWT token. Let's create a parse JWT method. And we're going to parse the request to get the JWT. If you've used Postman before, whenever we send a request, the JWT comes in looking something like the following. So it looks like bearer, and then there is a JWT token. What we're interested in is just this part. We don't want the bearer string. So that's what we're going to do in the parse JWT method. So let's create a private string parse JWT. We're going to pass the HTTP server request. And we're going to get the header from the request. So we want the authorization header. And then we're going to check if the header is not null and the header starts with bearer. We're simply just going to do a substring and just take the remaining JWT token that we're actually interested in. So what we can actually do is let's extract this as a constant. We can also add bearer.length. Once we have parsed our JWT, we want to check that the JWT is not null. And we also want to check that the JWT is actually valid. So we're going to be using the validate JWT token method we have written in the JWT util. And we're going to pass the string representing the JWT token. So if that's valid, let's now authenticate the user. So we're going to get the username from our JWT token. So we're going to use the utility method we wrote earlier. get user from token JWT. Let's get the user details. So this user details is an interface in the Spring Security package. And we're going to get the user details from the user details service .load user by username. And here we're going to pass the username we get from the JWT token. So if you remember, this is where we are going to get our user details user. So once we have our user details, we can now use those details to create a username, password, authentication token. Create a new object called new username authentication token. We want to pass the user details. We want to pass credentials is null here. And we want to get the user details.get authorities. So in this case, if you remember, this is just going to be empty. The next thing we want to now do with this authentication token is the following. We want to do authentication token.set details, and we want to create a new web authentication detail source .build details, and we're going to pass the request we got up here. And now we can actually set the security context holder .get context to be equal to the authentication token. Let's try security context. Okay, there was a typo. Context holder. So typo is gone. We have set our security context to be the authentication token we have just set up in these operations. So once all this is done, let's add the catch for any exception that might occur. Set a log error. Cannot set user authentication. At the end, very important, we want to continue the filter chain. So we do filter chain.doFilter and we pass the request to the next filters. We have implemented a filter that is going to do verification of our JWT and then authenticate and set the security context for our application. And the last thing that we have to do is just define a web security configuration class. So let's go in security package and let's create a web security config class. Let's tag it as a configuration. And in here, we want to auto-wire the custom user details we have created earlier. We want to auto-wire the private auth entry point JWT to handle unauthorized requests. We want to define a bean that is going to tell Spring Security to use the auth token filter to authenticate JWT. We also want to set a bean for our public authentication manager. So this manager handles the authentication. So this is something you want to define in this configuration class. And we also want to finally define a public password encoder. And this is going to return a new bycrypt password encoder, just one of the encoders that are available to us in Spring Security. In here, we now want to define a security filter chain to allow requests or block requests to certain endpoints. So this is going to be another bean, and this is going to return a security filter chain. So let's import that. It's going to take as input HTTP security object. You can throw an exception. We want to take this HTTP request and we want to set few attributes. So the first one is to disable CSRF. So this is up to you. In our case, we don't really need this. So I'm going to disable it. Abstraction figurer. We also want to disable course. We don't really need it. So abstract HTTP configurer. Disable. There was a typo. So we want to handle the exception. And to handle the exception, we want to use the unauthorized handler we created. We want to set the exception handling authentication entry point to be the auth entry point JWT class we created. Session management, we want to handle the session creation policy. And we want this to be stateless. Next, we want to authorize HTTP requests. In this case, you want to set the authorization request to request matchers. So what this means is that requests to these paths, API v1 auth, these are authentication endpoints we're going to create just after we complete the security filter chain, which are going to allow users to sign up and get JWT tokens. So we want this to be available without any kind of authentication. And then I'm also going to be creating a welcome endpoint. So we want this welcome to be available to everyone. And that's why we have added permit all. And then any other request, we want it to be authenticated. We have done few operations in here. I have not gone in detail, but the most important one you really need to understand is this one, where we are matching requests. We are allowing some requests, but all of the requests, we want them to be authenticated. And then we are handling exceptions using the custom exception handler we created. Once all of this is done, let's do http.addFilter before. We want to add the JWT token filter before the username password authentication filter. So we're going to do authentication JWT token filter, and then we want to do username authentication filter.class. And finally, we want to return this HTTP filter chain by doing http.build. And we have done all of the authentication ourselves. By adding all these classes, we have added JWT authentication to our application. The only thing left are our controller classes where we have the actual REST endpoints. Let's create a new package called controller. In here, we want to create two new controller classes. So one is going to be the authentication controller. This is going to be a REST controller. Request mapping is going to be API v1/auth. We want to add few attributes, so authentication manager. We want to add the user repository. We want to also add the password encoder we had defined in our configuration class, and we also want the JWT util we have created. Let's inject them into the constructor. And now we can create few endpoints. So we're going to create a post endpoint to sign in users, public string authenticate user. This is going to get as input a request body of a user object. And this is going to do some authentication. So authentication equals to authentication manager dot authenticate. This is going to create authentication. We're going to do get username dot get. So there is something wrong in here. Authentication. Yeah, so this import is wrong. So we have to be careful about that. The import we want is actually from the Spring Security class, not from Tomcat. So what we're doing here is we're going to use the authentication manager.authenticate method to actually create this username password authentication token. And the input is going to be the username and the password. And what we want to do afterwards is get the user details. User details. Authentication.getPrincipal. This is going to get us the principal. We want to return JWT utils.generate token using the username from the user details. Oh, we're missing the equals. So we're creating a user details, which we're going to get from the authentication.getPrincipal. And then we'll get the username from that user details and we'll just generate a token. We can also get the username from this object. It's the same thing. Yeah, I think it makes sense to just get the username from what is actually in the authentication.getPrincipal. So this is going to sign us in and get us a JWT token. But before being able to get a JWT token, you want to sign up. We want to create a new post endpoint called sign up. We're going to register a user. And what we want to do is actually check if user repository already has this username. So user.getUsername. We're going to return a message user already exists. Otherwise, let's create a user, new user. We're going to pass the username and we're going to encode using our bcrypt password encoder, the plain text password. And then we're going to save this into the user repository, and we'll just send a message saying user registered successfully. So what is happening in here is we're first going to sign up a new user, and then in the sign in endpoint, a user is going to be able to get the JWT token that they can use to call REST endpoints. So let's now create a REST endpoint. So I'm going to create a new controller class called main controller. So this is a REST controller as well. Let's add the request mapping API v1. In here, I'm going to create 3 very simple endpoints. Let's call it welcome. One is a welcome endpoint that is going to be available to everyone. Then we have a user endpoint that is only going to be available by users sending a request using a JWT. And same for the special one. This is just to show you that every endpoint that we have not defined in our web security endpoint over here is actually going to be protected as well by this any request authenticated clause. So if we go back to main controller, we have defined these 3 endpoints. It's now time to test our application. Let's create a configuration. Spring JWT, you can give it any name. Let's select the main class. Let's click apply and OK. And let's run our application. So the application has started successfully. Let's try to just call this welcome endpoint. So let's try to call the welcome endpoint initially. So let's click send. As you can see, this is unauthorized, but that's because we called the wrong endpoint. Even though it doesn't exist, it's still giving unauthorized. But now that we are calling the correct one, welcome, we are getting the correct response back. Let's try the user endpoint. We're getting 401 unauthorized as we expected. Let's try with special. Still 401 as we were expecting. Now let's try to create a new user. So the first thing we need to do is actually sign up a user. As you can see, I already tried, but let's do it again. So let's call auth sign up. Let's give a username and a password. So the user has registered successfully. Let's now get a JWT token by calling the sign-in endpoint. We need to give again the username and the password we have used to sign up. Let's click send. We can see down here we've got a JWT token. So let's get this JWT token. Let's go back to our special endpoint. Let's go to authorization and let's add a bearer token. In here we're going to paste our JWT token. If we click send, we can see now we get a 200 back. Let's say you had the wrong token by a few letters. This is unauthorized as expected. So let's fix it back. Let's try to sign up with the same username. We're getting user already exists. Let's try to sign in again. We get a new JWT token, but let's say the password is wrong. Let's see what happens. We are getting 401 unauthorized because it's the wrong password for the user we are providing. So correctly we are getting a 401 unauthorized. And if we put the correct one, we get a JWT, which you can now use to also access the user endpoint. User content with JWT. What we have done in this video is we have protected the REST endpoints using JWT tokens. I have also created another video where I show how to use Keycloak to provide JWT authentication into a microservices application. So go check that out. I hope you found this video useful, and if you want me to create more videos like this, just leave it in the comment box below.